Hello, peoples. So last time I cut off with what was probably a perhaps shocking statement about what the actual true nuclear family was. But I've actually got one other question that I was asked while I was talking about this with some friends, and I think it's worth answering that question first because it ties in well with what I'm actually talking about here. And the question was, why am I focusing so much on nuclear families when this is supposed to be a channel about women's spirituality? And the reason that I'm doing this is because, frankly, I think families are an important part of women's spirituality. Feminism itself doesn't give, it gives women rather, no, that's not fair. It gives mothers rather short shrift. It's like, why are you staying home? Why aren't you making your own way? That kind of thing. And I say this as a child-free woman. I never wanted kids. But I do think if we're going to be fair to women, then we have to give women all of the opportunities and options that they want. So if they want to be mothers, if they want to be completely career-oriented, if they want to mix them, I think it's up to them. And I think a healthy society and a healthy feminism will say, will be supportive of any of the options that these women choose because they are trying to be a healthy part of a healthy society. The other thing which is kind of important is, and I think anyone who has been part of an unhealthy family will agree with me on this one, but the truth is, if you were raised as a child in an unhealthy family, it's hard to recover from that. It takes a lot of time and effort. Some people never do recover. And frankly, if we can forestall that completely by making sure that people grow up in families that love them and actually want them and help to raise them to be healthy children, then I think that's a huge step forward for all of us right away. And that's the kind of thing that is important to women's spirituality. We want more people to be healthy, empowered, and able to help other people as well. Another thing is that women's spirituality does not shear off the sacred from the secular. And everyday life itself is sacred in women's spirituality. And this is a very common thing from what I've seen, at least, in many of the patriarchal religions. You know, here you're in religion, or you're in church, temple, whatever, mosque, and this is when it is sacred ground. And then you leave there, and it's like they completely forget what they were just talking about during the sermon or the speech or the talk or the reading. And one of the things that I work at with women's spirituality, because this is not easy for me either. I was raised in a patriarchal society, and it's very easy to say, now I'm praying, now I'm sacred, now I'm done. I'm going to go out and work on the computer, and if it's very frustrating, I may swear and be grumpy and not be compassionate to myself, which is what women's spirituality asks of you. So there's that also. And perhaps the most important reason, I don't know that it's the most important, one of the more powerful reasons is that flexibility of choice is actually healthier as a species, as a people, as an individual. And this can go dramatically from physically to spiritually to emotionally. It has ramifications across all of that spectrum. So, for example, what's a good example? Well, let's start with physical. There are creatures, animals, plants, where, for example, parthenogenesis is how they reproduce. Parthenogenesis is when the female basically creates an exact copy of herself. And there are no males necessary. And this is, actually this is really cool when I first read about this. Parthenogenesis is a more successful technique than sexual reproduction as long as the environment doesn't change. The thing is, sexual reproduction introduces mistakes, mutations, other alternatives, whereas parthenogenesis, if the mother has lived very successfully in this environment, then her daughters, who are just like her, will live just as successfully in that environment. Whereas, like I said, when you introduce sexual reproduction, that introduces the possibility of mistakes, of genetic sports, of issues like that, and they will not live as fruitfully as they will not match as well to their environment. But the fact remains, the environment likes to change, and so having both of those alternatives is actually healthier in the long run for a species. And that's, we're seeing a situation, to me at least, where I see a situation like that, in that I think we should have more alternatives available for women and also for men. You see that in a culture, in the hegemonic perspective as opposed to actual reality. What's a good example? Perfect. We'll go right back to nuclear families. The ones that aren't actually nuclear, the ones that are patriarchy considers them nuclear, I should say. A hegemonic perspective is one that is just like everybody else in the culture. And generally, where that comes from, the hegemonic perspective. Okay, I'm going to give a real quick explanation of this. And I'm doing it out of memory, so if I make mistakes, I'll try and catch them in the description below. But there was a man around the end of, it was during World War II. And he was Italian. And his name was, oh, yes, I remembered. Wow, that's great. His name was Antonio Gramsci. And he was very much against Mussolini's government. One of the things that he came up with was an interesting concept where he basically said, the reason that it's so very hard to change some cultures is because the perspective of the ruling class, which benefits them, is presented via media, via example, things like that. And they control the media because they're the ruling class, so they can portray things the way they like. But anyway, the desire, I'm sure you've heard me say that again, that's the alarm for outside. But the perspective of the ruling class is presented as the only right and natural perspective. And they are presented as somebody that you want to aspire to be, especially if you're working class. And the problem with this is that their hegemonic perspective, which is adopted by the working class, does not benefit the working class, but the working class fervently believes I'm going to set this to music or something. Sorry. The working class fervently believes that this is the right, the natural, the common sense way to behave. Anybody who was even thinking would, of course, all right-thinking individuals would want to do this. And so what they do is they unwittingly participate in and sustain their own oppression because they agree with the strictures that the ruling class are saying are the proper way to behave. We see this, unfortunately, we see this with some women too, who will participate in their own oppression by agreeing with men that women aren't trustworthy, or that women are so fickle, or that women are weak and stupid and need to be controlled. And when you hear a woman talking like that, it's always a tragedy as far as I'm concerned, because it basically says that this woman has, whether unwittingly or knowingly, she's participating in her own oppression because she has bought into, hook, line, and sinker, this perspective of the class that is ruling over her, which in this particular case is men. So that's kind of a quickie on what hegemonic thought is. And the reason that's important is that hegemonic thought says that the proper family, the type of family you should aspire to, the only correct way to raise children, all that kind of thing, is a man married to a woman where the man is in control and they live on their own. They don't live in an extended family or in a community. And the reason that I mention hegemonic thought as being different from reality is because our culture in the United States says this is what you want to aspire to. You want to aspire to a nuclear family. But nuclear families are actually well into the minority. They are not the standard. They really were only the standard for a very short period of time. In fact, after World War II, if I remember correctly. Excuse me. I'll have to check that more later. But it is really interesting, the difference between hegemonic thought and actual reality. Unfortunately, hegemonic thought, when everybody is thinking the same, when you don't have the perspective of many different people, they've actually done studies on this, and they've found that it tends to narrow people's perspective, worldview, I guess is a good way to put it. But people that are not hegemonic thinkers, they tend to be more mentally flexible, more creative, more productive, and more tolerant, which is quite the trifecta of good results, I would think. So, and that's kind of a quickie introduction to hegemonic thought. I don't know if that helps, but that's one of the things that women's spirituality does not agree with, because women's spirituality wants you to be true to yourself. People who are deeply immersed in hegemonic thought frequently don't even realize it, and that's the really sad part, is because they don't even realize that they are making their lives worse without meaning to or wanting to, honestly. So where did this come from? Let me think. If I remember correctly, the real flourishing, like I said earlier, of nuclear families, the so-called nuclear family, was right after World War II. This was when the GIs were returning home, and in some ways it was really sad, but in other ways it was really emblematic of the whole problem with nuclear families, so-called nuclear families, is these GIs were returning home. Well, while they were at war, women had flooded into industry to make sure that things kept being produced, that the war material that these soldiers needed was actually there when they needed it. And frequently, a lot of these women at the end of the war did not want to go home. They liked their jobs. They liked having money. They liked feeling like they were supporting themselves and their community. And what happened was there was a whole bunch of men who came back, and they all wanted to go back to normality. They all wanted to have a job. They all wanted to get married. And the government wanted, and I think rightfully so, the government wanted to thank them for pretty much endangering their lives to ensure that authoritarianism did not take over the world. But what the government ended up doing, and again, this is a perfect example of hegemonic thought in action. What the government ended up doing is, through media and through gentle social pressure, convinced men that women made poor employees. And so women would get laid off if they got pregnant, or they would get laid off because a particular industry decided that it shouldn't be managed by women, and there shouldn't be women employees there anymore. What the media was doing is, through things like movies, consumer goods, and similar things like that, is that they were pitching these consumer goods to women as housewives. The same thing with movies. The movies were presenting the desired goal for women and men was to be married. So there were a lot of romances, where women and men were getting married, and the man and the woman would go off for their family. And you didn't see movies about, for example, women having their own jobs. Wow, I would have to go and look, but I think there were a lot of Westerns at that time too. I have no idea. I'll have to go check. Anyway, there was also a period of time, although that may have been a little later, that might have been the 50s, where every time there was a divorced woman in the movie, she died by the end of the movie because divorce was just that depressing. Women just couldn't handle it, that kind of nonsense. And it made for a very powerful social pressure, which was kind of unspoken in the sense of nobody said, you must fire all the women that work for you. But, if a woman had to quit, she couldn't find another job. If a man had a job available, he would hire a man before he'd hire a woman. And so women were very slowly, firmly pushed out of all of these jobs and into the home. And for the ones that preferred that was fine. But there were an awful lot of women at the time who really didn't want to be housewives. And that was the beginning of, how do I put that? I think that was planting the seeds that would erupt in the 60s into feminism and the entire counterculture movement of that time. Oh gosh, okay. I'm going to pause here, and I will continue in the next one, because this is really cool. I'm enjoying doing little bits of research for this to make sure that I've got my stuff correct. And I have a couple of things I may have to correct in the comments, in the description for this one too. So if you're still here and you enjoyed yourself, please push the like button, and I hope you're subscribed. And what else? Share with friends, and I always look forward to comments. Polite comments where we can actually discuss knowledgeably with each other and in a friendly fashion. They make this ever so much more enjoyable. And they give me good ideas on what you want me to talk about. So I hope you're having a great day. I hope it continues to be great, and I will talk with you all later. Take care. Bye-bye.